Pay attention to what you're about to see. This is raw footage captured by a delivery driver's dashcam on March 14th, pulling up to what looked like an ordinary children's facility in rural Montana. Look closely at those faces hanging on the wall behind the kids. Count them if you can. Notice how some are screaming, others peaceful, some smiling. The 6 children sitting at that table eating their meal. Watch their expressions. See how they don't react to the camera, how they just keep eating, mechanical, rehearsed, like they've done this 1,000 times before. That driver had no idea he'd just documented one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. He thought he was dropping off supplies to a struggling orphanage. Instead, he captured the moment before everything unraveled, before investigators would discover that those weren't decorations on that wall. They were tombstones. 42 of them. Each one a child who never made it out alive. You know that feeling when you drive past an old building and wonder what stories hide behind those walls? For the residents of Clearwater County, Montana, the Whispering Pines Children's Sanctuary was just another fixture in the landscape, the kind of place you'd see from the highway and think, oh, that's nice, they're helping troubled kids. Maybe you'd feel good about it for a second before returning to your own life, your own problems. But here's the thing about assumptions. Sometimes they're dead wrong. The building sat on 12 acres of forest land, about 40 miles outside Helena. Gray stone walls, a sloping roof that had seen better days, windows that always seemed to have the curtains drawn. Local contractors had done work there over the years. A new boiler in 2009, roof repairs in 2013, plumbing fixes in 2015. Nobody thought twice about it. Just regular maintenance on an old structure trying to keep troubled children off the streets. The woman who ran it, Eleanor Dresden, was 58 years old by the time authorities knocked on her door. She'd operated Whispering Pines since 2006, taking in children that the system had given up on, runaways, addicts, kids with behavioral problems so severe their own parents couldn't handle them anymore. She presented herself as a savior, someone willing to do the hard work that nobody else wanted to touch. People in Clearwater County knew Eleanor by sight. She'd come into town maybe once a month for supplies, bulk rice, canned goods, cleaning products. She drove a beat-up 1998 Dodge van that needed new shocks. She dressed simply, spoke softly, and always paid in cash. The cashiers at the general store thought she seemed tired but dedicated. One of them, Linda Martinez, later told investigators she'd always admired Eleanor's commitment to those troubled children. She seemed like a saint, Linda said, taking in all those kids nobody wanted. The irony of that statement would haunt Linda for years. March 14, 2018, started like any other Wednesday for Thomas Chen, a 34-year-old delivery driver for Mountain States Supply Company. He'd been on the job for 3 years, knew every back road in the region, could navigate the routes with his eyes closed. That morning, he had 6 stops scheduled, including a delivery to Whispering Pines. 400 pounds of rice, beans, and canned vegetables that Eleanor Dresden had ordered 3 weeks prior. Thomas had made deliveries there before, 4 or 5 times over the past year, maybe more. He'd always found it a little odd how Eleanor would meet him outside, help him unload into a shed near the main building, then send him on his way. He'd never been inside, never seen any of the children up close. But people had their reasons for privacy, especially when dealing with troubled youth. He understood that. This time was different. Thomas pulled up the gravel driveway at 10:47 a.m., his dashcam automatically recording as it always did. The property looked quiet. Too quiet. No Eleanor waiting outside like usual. No sounds of children playing or working. Just silence, thick and heavy like fog. He sat in his truck for a few minutes, waiting. Then he honked. Nothing. He checked his phone. No messages, no calls. The delivery was scheduled, confirmed, paid for. So where was everyone? Against his better judgment, Thomas got out of the truck and approached the main building. The front door was unlocked. He knocked first, called out Eleanor's name. No response. That's when he noticed the smell. Nothing overwhelming, just a faint odor of mildew and something else he couldn't quite place. Old food, maybe. Poor ventilation. He pushed the door open. The scene that greeted him would replay in his nightmares for the rest of his life. 6 children sat at a long wooden table in what appeared to be a dining hall. They ranged in age from maybe 7 to 12 years old. They were eating rice, some kind of stew, water in plastic cups, and they didn't look up when he entered, didn't acknowledge his presence at all, just kept eating, slow and methodical, like robots going through programmed motions. But that's not what made Thomas freeze in the doorway. Behind the children, covering nearly the entire back wall, hung dozens upon dozens of faces, plaster faces, death masks, some with eyes closed, peaceful expressions frozen forever, others with mouths open in silent screams. A few, and this detail would haunt investigators, seemed to be smiling, genuine childlike smiles captured in that final moment. Thomas later described it to police as the most wrong thing I've ever seen. He knew immediately, instinctively, that he was looking at something terrible, something evil. He pulled out his phone and called 911. "I need police," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm at the Whispering Pines place on Route 47. There are kids here and there's something really wrong. I don't know how to explain it. Just send someone. Now." The dispatcher, Rachel Kowalski, had worked emergency services for 12 years. She'd heard panic before, heard fear, heard people at their absolute worst. But something in Thomas's voice made her hair stand up. "Sir, are the children in immediate danger?" Thomas looked at the 6 kids at the table. They still hadn't acknowledged him. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but something is very, very wrong here." Sheriff Marcus Webb arrived 18 minutes later with 2 deputies. By then, Thomas had backed out to his truck, keeping eyes on the building but unable to go back inside. His hands were still shaking when he pointed toward the entrance. "They're just sitting there," he told Sheriff Webb, "eating, with all those faces on the wall behind them." Marcus Webb had been law enforcement in Montana for 23 years. He'd seen domestic violence, drug overdoses, fatal car accidents, hunting incidents gone wrong. He thought he'd developed a thick skin, a professional distance that let him do the job without taking the trauma home. He was wrong. When Webb entered that dining hall, when he saw those 6 children still mechanically eating their meal, when his eyes traveled up to the wall behind them, 42 plastered death masks hanging like trophies, he felt something inside him crack. "Kids," he said, keeping his voice calm and gentle. "I'm Sheriff Webb. Can you tell me what's happening here?" The children didn't respond, didn't look at him, just kept eating. One of the deputies, Sarah Martinez, approached the table slowly. She knelt down next to a boy who looked about 9 years old, thin with hollow eyes and clothes that hung off his frame. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly. "Are you okay? Where are the adults?" The boy turned his head toward her, and what Sarah saw in his eyes made her chest tighten. They were empty, completely empty, like looking into a doll's face. "The ceremony isn't until Sunday," the boy said in a flat, rehearsed voice. "Mother Eleanor chooses on Sunday." Sarah looked up at Sheriff Webb. He'd gone pale. "Search the building," Webb ordered. "Now!" What they found in the next hour would transform this from a welfare check into one of the largest criminal investigations in Montana's history. Eleanor Dresden's office was on the 2nd floor, a small room with a desk, filing cabinets, and walls covered in religious imagery, crosses, paintings of saints, verses from scripture. She sat in her chair, head slumped forward onto the desk, a small caliber revolver still in her right hand. Blood had pooled on the desk surface and dripped onto the floor. The medical examiner would later determine she'd died approximately 12 to 18 hours before police arrived. Beside her body, open and displayed deliberately, were 3 leather-bound journals filled with her handwriting. Deputy James Rodriguez was the first to start reading. By the 2nd page, he was on his phone calling for backup, calling for state investigators, calling for anyone who could help process what they'd stumbled into. The journals detailed everything. 8 years of systematic murder. 8 years of what Eleanor called necessary culling for the survival of the worthy. She'd started Whispering Pines with the best intentions, she wrote, or at least intentions she believed were best. Taking in children the system had abandoned, giving them structure and purpose. But funding had been limited from the start. Donations dried up. Government support never materialized. And Eleanor found herself responsible for 20, then 30, then eventually 48 children, with nowhere near enough resources to feed them all. Most people would have reached out for help, applied for grants, contacted social services, asked the community for support. Eleanor Dresden chose a different path. She developed what she called the choosing ceremony. When food supplies ran critically low, which happened every few months according to her meticulous records, Eleanor would gather all the children and conduct what she framed as a spiritual ritual. She'd pray, ask for divine guidance, then select 1 or 2 children who she claimed were ready for heaven's embrace. The selected children would be taken to the basement. They wouldn't come back. Her journals described the process in disturbing detail. She'd starve the chosen children over a period of days, believing that fasting brought them closer to God. When they were weak enough, she'd use a pillow to suffocate them, all while praying over their bodies. She convinced herself this was mercy, that she was saving these troubled children from lives of pain and sin, sending them to paradise while using their remains to sustain the survivors. Let me be clear about what that means, because the horror of this case deserves honesty. Eleanor Dresden engaged in cannibalism. She would prepare the bodies of the children she murdered, grinding the remains into the meals she served to the survivors. The stew those 6 children were eating when Thomas Chen found them, the stew they'd been conditioned to eat without question, likely contained the processed remains of their former companions. The basement revealed the full extent of her crimes. Detectives found 38 sets of fragmented bones buried in shallow graves beneath the concrete floor. Some had been there for years, slowly decomposing in the damp earth. Others were more recent, still showing tissue attachment. But here's what made even hardened investigators struggle to process the scene: the masks. Eleanor had created an elaborate ritual around death. Before killing each child, she would apply plaster of Paris to their faces, creating death masks that captured their final expressions. Sometimes the children were already dead or dying. Sometimes, according to her journals, she applied the plaster while they were still conscious, still aware of what was happening. She hung these masks on the dining hall wall, creating what she called the Gallery of Innocence. In her twisted logic, this preserved the children forever, gave them immortality through art. The survivors, the 6 children police found that Wednesday morning, had been forced to participate in creating these masks. They'd mixed the plaster, applied it to their friends' faces, helped Eleanor hang them on the wall. Then they'd been forced to eat meals beneath the dead faces of children they'd known, children they'd played with, children who'd slept in the bunk above them or shared their chores. Day after day, month after month, year after year, the psychological torture of it, beyond the physical abuse, beyond the starvation and fear, was almost incomprehensible. Sheriff Webb called in the FBI at 2:30 p.m. that afternoon. Special Agent Victoria Lambert arrived from the Salt Lake City field office with a team of forensic specialists. By nightfall, Whispering Pines was swarming with law enforcement, media helicopters circling overhead, satellite trucks lining the access road. The 6 surviving children, whose names I'll change to protect their privacy even now, were immediately taken to Helena Regional Medical Center. Michael, age 11, Sarah, age 10, David and Daniel, 9-year-old twins, Emma, age 8, and little Rebecca, who was only 6 years old. The medical team that examined them found evidence of severe chronic malnutrition, untreated infections, dental decay, and psychological trauma so profound that several of the children were initially nonverbal. They'd been taught that speaking without permission meant you might be chosen next. Silence had become survival. Dr. Patricia Wong, the pediatric psychiatrist assigned to their care, later testified that in her 30 years of practice, she'd never encountered children so systematically broken. They'd been conditioned to view their own deaths as inevitable, she explained. The only question in their minds wasn't if they'd be chosen, but when. They'd watched it happen to 42 other children. They'd helped make the masks. They'd eaten the meals. They knew exactly what was happening, and they'd learned that resistance was impossible. As news of the case spread, families across Montana and neighboring states started calling authorities. Parents who'd sent their troubled children to Whispering Pines years ago, believing they'd given them a chance at rehabilitation. Parents who'd received letters and report cards that Eleanor had forged, making them believe their children were thriving. Thomas and Jennifer Holbrook called from Boise, Idaho. Their daughter, Katie, had been sent to Whispering Pines in 2011 when she was 13. She'd struggled with drug abuse and run away from home multiple times. Eleanor had promised she could help, and the Holbrooks, desperate and exhausted, had believed her. They'd received letters from Katie for 2 years before the correspondence stopped. Eleanor told them Katie had run away again, and they'd believed that too. Katie's mask hung on the wall, 3rd row, 2nd from the left, her expression frozen mid-scream. Michael and Patricia Rossi called from Denver. Their son James had been placed at Whispering Pines in 2014. Behavioral issues, they'd said. Too aggressive, too defiant. They'd thought they were doing the right thing. The letters they received told them James was improving, learning discipline, finding peace. James's mask was in the 2nd row, eyes closed, almost peaceful. The calls kept coming. Parents devastated by guilt, by grief, by the knowledge that they'd unknowingly sent their children to a nightmare. Some had lost touch with their kids years ago and assumed they'd simply moved on with their lives. Others had believed Eleanor's lies about runaways and fresh starts. Each mask on that wall represented a child who'd been betrayed by the adults meant to protect them. The investigation into Whispering Pines became a multi-agency effort involving the FBI, Montana State Police, the County Sheriff's Department, and forensic teams from across the region. The scope was staggering: 8 years of crimes, dozens of victims, thousands of pages of evidence. Special Agent Victoria Lambert took lead on coordinating the investigation. At 42 years old, she'd worked major crimes for 15 years, including cases involving child exploitation and human trafficking, but nothing had prepared her for this. The methodical nature of it, she later said in an interview, that's what got to everyone. This wasn't a moment of rage or a psychotic break. Eleanor Dresden systematically murdered children over nearly a decade, and she documented every single decision like she was running a business. The journals became the prosecution's most damning evidence, but they also created an almost unbearable emotional burden for investigators. Eleanor had written in extensive detail about each child, their personalities, their fears, why she'd chosen them for the ceremony. She'd noted their reactions to starvation, their final words, whether they'd cried or prayed or begged. Reading those entries broke people. Veteran detectives requested transfers. FBI agents needed counseling. One forensic technician quit law enforcement entirely after processing the journals and never worked in the field again. But someone had to do it. Someone had to document every horror, catalog every crime, build a case that would stand up in court if Eleanor Dresden had lived to face trial. The forensic excavation of the basement took 3 weeks. Anthropologists from the University of Montana worked alongside FBI evidence teams, carefully unearthing the remains of 38 children from graves that ranged from 6 inches to 3 feet deep. Each excavation site was photographed, measured, documented. Every bone fragment was cataloged and tested for DNA. Matching the remains to the missing children became a monumental task. Some families had reported their children missing after losing contact with Whispering Pines. Others never had. They'd believed Eleanor's stories about runaways and fresh starts, assumed their troubled kids had simply chosen to cut ties with their past. Dr. Raymond Fisher, The forensic anthropologist leading the excavation found evidence that some children had been dismembered after death. Cut marks on bones indicated use of saws and knives, consistent with Eleanor's journal entries about preparing sustenance for the survivors. The reality of cannibalism, of children being fed the remains of other children, created legal complexities that prosecutors had rarely encountered. Montana law had statutes against desecration of corpses, but the intentional processing of human remains for consumption fell into murky territory. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Freeman spent weeks researching precedent. He consulted with prosecutors in other states, looked at federal statutes, even examined international cases. What Eleanor had done was so far beyond normal criminal behavior that the legal system struggled to categorize it. While the forensic teams worked the basement, another group of investigators focused on how Eleanor had operated for so long without detection. How had state inspectors visited the facility multiple times and never noticed 42 children had vanished? The answer was both simple and infuriating: corruption mixed with incompetence. State Child Welfare Inspector Donald Marks had been assigned to Whispering Pines since 2010. He was supposed to conduct quarterly inspections, verify the well-being of each child, ensure proper living conditions and education. His reports consistently gave the facility passing marks: adequate food, clean facilities, children showing progress in behavioral rehabilitation. He'd never actually done a thorough inspection. FBI agents discovered that Marks had accepted cash payments from Eleanor Dresden, totaling over $48,000 between 2010 and 2018. In exchange, he'd file positive reports without ever counting the children or conducting individual interviews. He'd show up, walk through the main building for 30 minutes, accept an envelope from Eleanor, then leave. The children learned to stay silent during his visits. Eleanor would gather only the survivors to show him, claiming the others were on work detail or in classes. Marks never questioned it, never investigated, never cared enough to verify. When confronted by investigators, he initially tried to deny everything. Then, faced with bank records showing cash deposits coinciding with each inspection visit, he broke down. He claimed he'd been in debt, going through a divorce, needed the money. He'd convinced himself the facility was fine, that Eleanor was doing good work, that cutting corners on paperwork didn't really matter. 42 dead children proved otherwise. Donald Marks would eventually face charges of bribery, corruption, and negligent homicide. His failure to do his job had directly enabled Eleanor Dresden's crimes to continue for 8 years. But he wasn't the only one who'd failed these children. The Montana Department of Child Services had received 3 separate complaints about Whispering Pines between 2012 and 2016. Parents reporting they couldn't reach their children. A teacher from a nearby school who'd encountered some of the kids on a rare trip to town and noticed they seemed afraid and malnourished. A postal worker who thought it was strange that the facility never seemed to get mail for individual children, only bulk deliveries for Eleanor. Each complaint had been filed, assigned to investigators, then closed without serious follow-up. Budget constraints, they said, understaffing, priorities focused on urban facilities with larger populations. The excuses rang hollow when stacked against 42 dead children. Department Director Janet Holloway resigned in disgrace 2 months after the case broke. 3 other administrators were fired. The governor ordered a complete overhaul of the state's child welfare inspection system. None of it would bring back the children who'd died, while bureaucrats shuffled paperwork and cashed bribe money. Meanwhile, the 6 survivors were beginning the long, painful process of recovery at a specialized trauma facility in Helena. Dr. Patricia Wong and her team worked with them daily, trying to help them understand that they were safe now, that no one was going to hurt them anymore, that they could eat without fear of what the food might contain. Progress was agonizingly slow. Michael, the oldest at 11, had assumed a protective role over the others during their time at Whispering Pines. He'd tried to comfort younger children when they were chosen, held them when they cried, told them stories to distract them from their terror. The guilt of surviving when so many others hadn't eaten him alive. He barely spoke for the first month in care, and when he finally did, it was to apologize for not saving his friends. "I should have fought harder," he told Dr. Wong through tears. "I should have protected them." How do you explain to an 11-year-old that he'd been a victim too? That no child should ever have to protect other children from being murdered? That survival didn't make him guilty? Sarah, age 10, had recurring nightmares about the choosing ceremonies. She'd wake up screaming, convinced it was Sunday again, convinced Eleanor was coming to select her this time. The nursing staff learned to stay with her until the panic subsided, reminding her over and over that Eleanor was dead, that the ceremonies were over forever. The twins, David and Daniel, had developed their own private language during their time at Whispering Pines. They'd speak to each other in whispers that no one else could understand. A coping mechanism, Dr. Wong explained, that gave them some sense of control in an environment where they had none. Breaking through that barrier, helping them trust adults again, required months of patient work. Emma, at 8 years old, had been at the facility longer than any of the other survivors, since she was 4. She barely remembered life before Whispering Pines. The concept of a world where children weren't killed and eaten, where adults could be trusted, where food was just food. It was almost incomprehensible to her. And Rebecca, the youngest at 6, had shut down almost completely. She'd stopped speaking, stopped making eye contact, spent hours rocking back and forth while humming the same tune over and over. The staff eventually recognized it as a lullaby Eleanor used to sing before the choosing ceremonies. These were the lucky ones, the survivors, the 6 children who'd somehow made it through 8 years of systematic horror and lived to tell about it. But lucky felt like the wrong word. Because what kind of luck leaves you traumatized for life? What kind of survival comes with watching 42 other children die? As investigators worked through the spring and summer of 2018, they uncovered more disturbing details about how Eleanor had recruited children to Whispering Pines. She'd advertised in parenting magazines aimed at families struggling with troubled teens. She'd networked with therapists and social workers, positioning herself as a last resort for the most difficult cases. She'd kept her fees low, sometimes waiving them entirely, making her services accessible to desperate parents who couldn't afford traditional residential treatment. She'd been smart about it. Predatory, but smart. Detective Sarah Martinez led the team investigating Eleanor's background. What they found was a woman who'd spent most of her adult life working in child services in various capacities. She'd been a foster parent in the 1990s in Oregon, a group home supervisor in Nevada in the early 2000s. She'd never had criminal charges, never raised red flags, never given anyone reason to suspect she was dangerous. But there were hints if you knew where to look. 3 children who'd been in her foster care in Oregon had run away and never been found. A group home in Nevada had closed abruptly during her tenure, with reports of disciplinary issues that were never fully investigated. Nothing concrete enough to pursue legally, but a pattern of children vanishing from facilities under her supervision. Had she been killing children even then? Before Whispering Pines? The question haunted investigators, but without evidence or bodies, they'd never know for certain. What they did know was that Eleanor Dresden had been thinking about the Gallery of Innocence for a long time. Her journals from 2006, when she first opened Whispering Pines, already mentioned the spiritual significance of preserving children's faces. She'd been planning this from the beginning, waiting for the opportunity to act on her twisted philosophy. The opportunity came when funding problems started, when she realized she couldn't feed all the children in her care. A normal person would have sought help. Eleanor saw it as divine permission to begin her work. Her journals referenced religious texts constantly, twisted interpretations of scripture that justified her actions. She viewed herself as Abraham being tested by God, willing to sacrifice the innocent. She saw the surviving children as blessed, chosen to carry on God's work through their suffering. Mental health experts brought in to analyze her writings diagnosed her posthumously with severe delusional disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and possible psychopathy. But diagnoses didn't change what she'd done, didn't bring back the dead, didn't heal the survivors. By August 2018, investigators had identified 36 of the 38 sets of remains found in the basement. DNA matches with family members, dental records, and Eleanor's detailed journal entries made identification possible in most cases. 2 sets of remains, both very young children, possibly 5 or 6 years old, couldn't be matched to any missing persons reports. Eleanor had mentioned in her journals taking in children from homeless families, runaways with no paper trail, kids the system had never known about. Those 2 children would never be identified, never mourned by name, never get gravestones beyond the numbered markers in the county cemetery, where all the victims were eventually laid to rest. The death masks presented their own ethical dilemma. They were evidence, crucial to the case even though Eleanor was dead. But they were also the final images of 42 children, captured in moments of terror and death. What should be done with them? Some families wanted their children's masks for burial or memorial. Others couldn't bear to see them, wanted them destroyed entirely. The district attorney's office worked with a family advocacy group to create individual protocols for each mask, respecting the wishes of each family while preserving the evidence needed for the broader investigation. Several masks went to families for private burial. Others were documented extensively through photography and 3D scanning, then destroyed at family request. A handful remained in evidence storage, unclaimed by families who couldn't face the reality of what they represented. The media coverage was relentless. National news networks camped outside Whispering Pines for months. True crime podcasts dedicated entire seasons to the case. Documentary filmmakers tried to get access to evidence and survivors. Publishers offered book deals to investigators, attorneys, even the delivery driver who'd first discovered the scene. Everyone wanted a piece of the horror. Everyone wanted to understand how something so evil could happen in modern America. Sheriff Marcus Webb, who'd been first on scene, did one press conference in April 2018 and never spoke publicly about the case again. The questions reporters asked: what was it like seeing the masks? How did it feel to discover all those bodies? What do you think Eleanor's motive was? Felt obscene to him, like they were trying to turn tragedy into entertainment. Those were children, he said at the end of the press conference, his voice breaking. Real children with families who loved them. They deserved better than to become headlines. He walked off the stage and refused all subsequent interview requests. Even though Eleanor Dresden had taken her own life before facing justice, the investigation continued through the fall of 2018 and into 2019. Prosecutors needed to build a complete picture of her crimes, identify all victims, and pursue charges against those who'd enabled her through corruption or negligence. The breakthrough in understanding the full scope of Eleanor's operation came in October 2018, when FBI forensic technicians finally accessed her encrypted computer files. Eleanor had been meticulous about documentation, keeping digital records that supplemented her handwritten journals. What they found was chilling in its comprehensiveness. Eleanor had videotaped many of the choosing ceremonies and the subsequent murders. She'd filmed the creation of the death masks. She'd documented the processing of remains and the preparation of meals. All of it saved on encrypted drives hidden in her office. Special Agent Victoria Lambert had to watch those videos, had to verify their authenticity, catalog their content, prepare them as evidence for the cases against Donald Marks and the other enablers. She later described it as the worst assignment of her career. "I've seen a lot of evil," she told her therapist during a mandatory counseling session. But watching Eleanor Dresden suffocate a 9-year-old girl while praying over her body, then calmly applying plaster to her face as she died. "I don't think I'll ever be the same person I was before I saw that." The videos also revealed something investigators had suspected but couldn't prove from the journals alone. The surviving children had been forced to participate in the murders. Not directly, Eleanor had done the actual killing, but they'd been made to help prepare the victims, to hold them down when they struggled, to mix the plaster for the masks. Making them complicit had been part of Eleanor's control strategy. She'd bound them to her crimes through participation, making them believe they were guilty too, that they could never tell anyone what was happening because they'd be punished alongside her. It was psychological torture of the most sophisticated kind, and it had worked perfectly for 8 years. Among the computer files, investigators also found Eleanor's financial records. They revealed that she'd received over $200,000 in donations from parents over the years, money supposedly going toward their children's care. She'd kept meticulous records of every payment, every phone call with parents, every forged letter she'd sent claiming the children were doing well. The cruelty of it was staggering. She'd profited from these children twice, once from the payments their parents sent for care they never received, and again by using their bodies to feed the survivors, reducing her food costs. This financial evidence became crucial in pursuing wrongful death civil suits that several families filed against Eleanor's estate. Her property, vehicles, and remaining assets were liquidated to provide some compensation to the victims' families. It wasn't much. $200,000 split among 38 families didn't go far, but it was something. Remember that delivery driver footage from the beginning? The dashcam video that captured those 6 children eating at the table with 42 death masks hanging behind them? That footage became a pivotal piece of evidence, but not in the way you might expect. When FBI forensic video analysts examined Thomas Chen's dashcam recording, they discovered something that had been invisible to the naked eye, but became clear with enhancement. Eleanor Dresden was visible in the background of the shot, barely visible through a doorway, watching the children eat. The timestamp on the video was 10:47 a.m. on March 14th. The medical examiner had initially estimated Eleanor's death between 8 p.m. on March 13th and 2 a.m. on March 14th. But if she was alive and watching the children eat at 10:47 a.m., that timeline was wrong. Further analysis revealed the truth. Eleanor hadn't killed herself until after Thomas Chen had entered the building and called 911. She'd heard his voice, realized someone had finally discovered her operation, and gone upstairs to her office to take her own life while police were en route. Those children had been eating their last meal with Eleanor watching over them, knowing it was the end, knowing she was about to escape justice through death while leaving them to face the consequences of her crimes. The dashcam footage also captured audio, Thomas's voice as he called 911, the dispatcher's responses, the sound of him backing out of the building. But in the background, barely audible, you could hear one of the children humming, the same lullaby Rebecca had been humming in the trauma facility, the tune Eleanor sang before the choosing ceremonies. Those children had been so conditioned that even with a stranger present, even with help finally arriving, they'd continued their routine. Eating, humming, waiting to be chosen. The video was shown once during the criminal proceedings against Donald Marks. Several jurors cried. One had to be excused to compose herself. The judge ordered it sealed after that single viewing, ruling that its emotional impact was too severe to require repeated screenings. But the footage had served its purpose. It showed exactly what Marks's corruption had enabled. It made real the consequences of his decision to accept bribes instead of protecting children. Donald Marks's trial began in February 2019. He faced charges of bribery, corruption, reckless, negligent homicide, and child endangerment. His defense attorneys tried to argue that he couldn't have known what Eleanor was doing, that accepting money to file false reports wasn't the same as being complicit in murder. The jury didn't buy it. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Freeman's closing argument was devastating. He walked through each inspection visit Marks had made, each cash payment he'd accepted, each false report he'd filed. Then he put up 42 photographs, school pictures, family photos, images of smiling children who died while Donald Marks cashed his bribe money. Every single one of these children might be alive today, Freeman told the jury, if Inspector Marks had simply done the job he was paid to do, if he'd counted the children, if he'd interviewed them privately, if he'd cared more about their lives than about his bank account. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. 3 other state employees faced charges related to the Whispering Pines failure: a supervisor who'd ignored complaints, an administrator who'd approved Marks's consistently positive reports without verification, and a department director who'd cut inspection budgets despite knowing it would reduce oversight. All 3 took plea deals rather than face trial, reduced charges in exchange for cooperation and testimony about systemic failures in the child welfare system. The civil suits against the state of Montana moved forward in parallel with the criminal cases. Families sued for wrongful death, arguing that government negligence had enabled Eleanor's crimes. The state fought the suits initially, claiming they couldn't be held responsible for the actions of a private facility operator. But the evidence of corruption and systematic failure was overwhelming. In August 2019, the state agreed to a settlement. $30 million split among the 38 families whose children had been murdered, and comprehensive reforms to the child welfare inspection system. No amount of money could bring back the dead, but at least the state had been forced to acknowledge its failures. The 6 survivors continued their slow recovery through 2019 and into 2020. Dr. Patricia Wong and her team had worked with them for over 2 years by that point, using specialized trauma therapy techniques developed for victims of extreme abuse. Progress came in small increments. Michael finally started to sleep without nightmares about the choosing ceremonies. Sarah learned to eat without checking her food for anything unusual. The twins, David and Daniel, began speaking English again instead of their private language. Emma started to believe that adults could be trusted. Rebecca spoke her first words in nearly 3 years. They would never be fully healed. The trauma they'd experienced had fundamentally changed their brain development, their ability to form attachments, their understanding of safety and trust. But they were alive, and with support, they could build lives worth living. Several of the survivors eventually participated in victim impact statements that were read into the court record during the trials of the state employees. Michael, now 13, wrote about watching his friends die and being forced to help create their death masks. "I see their faces every time I close my eyes," he wrote. "I hear their screams in my dreams, and I know that grown-ups who were supposed to protect us chose money instead, chose not to ask questions, chose to let us die." His statement was read in court by his therapist, as Michael wasn't emotionally ready to attend in person. Several people in the courtroom wept openly. The physical site of Whispering Pines was demolished in November 2019, 20 months after the discovery of Eleanor's crimes. The building was torn down, the basement filled and sealed, the property cleared. A local advocacy group purchased the land with the intent of creating a memorial garden for the victims. Before demolition, families were given the opportunity to visit the site one final time. Some came to say goodbye to the places where their children had spent their final days. Others couldn't bear to see it and stayed away. The death masks that hadn't been claimed or destroyed were finally laid to rest in a private ceremony in December 2019. They were buried together in a single plot at the county cemetery, marked with a simple stone that read, "In memory of the children of Whispering Pines. Taken too soon. Forever remembered." The case had reverberations far beyond Montana. States across the country reviewed their child welfare inspection protocols. Congress held hearings on residential facility oversight. New federal regulations were proposed requiring independent verification of child populations, mandatory individual interviews, and criminal background checks for all facility operators. Eleanor Dresden's crimes had exposed systemic failures that extended across the entire country. How many other troubled children had vanished into facilities with inadequate oversight? How many other corrupt inspectors had accepted bribes to look the other way? How many other operators might be abusing their positions of trust? The questions were uncomfortable, but they needed to be asked. The Gallery of Innocence case, as it came to be known, changed Montana's approach to child welfare forever. The reforms implemented in the wake of Eleanor Dresden's crimes created one of the most comprehensive inspection systems in the country. Facilities must now undergo unannounced visits every 60 days. Every child must be interviewed privately. Population counts must be verified against documentation. Operators undergo annual background checks and financial audits. It won't prevent every tragedy. No system is perfect. But at least now, if something like Whispering Pines starts happening again, there's a better chance someone will notice before 42 children die. Donald Marks is serving 25 years in federal prison. He'll be 73 when he's eligible for parole. The other state employees who pled guilty received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. Their careers are over, their reputations destroyed, their names forever linked to one of the worst child welfare failures in American history. The 6 survivors are now young adults, scattered across the country, building lives for themselves with varying degrees of success. Some have changed their names and moved to places where nobody knows their story. Others have become advocates for child welfare reform, using their experiences to push for stronger protections. Michael, the oldest survivor, graduated high school in 2025. He's studying social work at a small college in the Pacific Northwest, determined to help other troubled children avoid the fate of his friends. He still has nightmares sometimes, but he's learned to manage them. He's learned that survival isn't the same as giving up, that living the best life he can is the greatest tribute he can offer to those who didn't make it. The twins, David and Daniel, now 20 years old, have remained close but live independent lives. David works in construction. Daniel is training to be an EMT. They still speak their private language sometimes when they're together, but they've opened up to the world in ways that seemed impossible in 2018. Sarah is studying art therapy, hoping to work with traumatized children. Emma is taking college courses online while working part-time at an animal shelter. The presence of dogs and cats has been therapeutic for her in ways traditional therapy couldn't match. Rebecca, the youngest, is still in intensive therapeutic care, but showing steady progress. They all carry the weight of what happened at Whispering Pines. They always will. But they're not letting it define them completely. They're not letting Eleanor Dresden have the final word on who they become. The families of the 38 children who died have formed a support group that meets monthly. They share memories of their lost children, support each other through the ongoing grief, and work together on advocacy efforts. Several have testified before state legislatures pushing for stronger oversight laws. Others have created scholarship funds in their children's names. Jennifer and Thomas Holbrook, who lost their daughter Katie, became the public faces of the advocacy movement. They speak at conferences, write op-eds, meet with legislators. They've said publicly that they'll never forgive themselves for sending Katie to Whispering Pines, but they can at least work to ensure other parents don't make the same mistake. "We trusted someone we shouldn't have trusted," Jennifer said in a 2022 interview. "We believed someone who seemed sincere but was actually a monster, and our daughter paid the price for our mistake. The least we can do now is make sure her death meant something, that it led to changes that will protect other children." The memorial garden on the site of Whispering Pines opened to the public in spring 2021. It's a peaceful place now, with walking paths, flower beds, and benches where people can sit and remember. At the center stands a sculpture, 42 bronze butterflies arranged in a spiral, each one engraved with the initials of a victim. The butterflies face outward, toward the sky, symbolizing freedom and transformation. Beneath them, a plaque reads, "They were children. They deserved better. We will remember." Eleanor Dresden's name doesn't appear anywhere in the memorial. The focus is on the victims, not the perpetrator. That was a deliberate choice by the families. Eleanor wanted immortality through her gallery. They weren't going to give it to her. Thomas Chen, the delivery driver whose dashcam captured that haunting final meal, struggled with PTSD for years after the discovery. He'd replay that moment in his mind constantly, pulling up to the building, seeing those children through his windshield, the masks on the wall behind them. He underwent therapy, changed careers, moved to a different state trying to escape the memories. In 2023, 5 years after that March morning, Thomas finally agreed to speak publicly about his experience. He participated in a documentary about the case, hoping his story might encourage others to trust their instincts when something feels wrong. "I knew the moment I saw it that something terrible had happened there," he said during filming. "Your gut tells you when evil is present. I just wish I'd been there sooner. Maybe I could have saved more of them." The therapist working with survivors reminded Thomas of something important. He didn't create the evil at Whispering Pines. He revealed it. His decision to enter that building, to call 911, to insist something was wrong, that saved 6 children who might otherwise have become victims number 39 through 44. The ripple effects of the case continue even now, years later. Dr. Patricia Wong, who worked with the survivors, published a groundbreaking study on recovery from extreme childhood trauma. Her work has influenced therapeutic approaches worldwide, helping other survivors of severe abuse find paths toward healing. Sheriff Marcus Webb retired from law enforcement in 2021. He couldn't continue after Whispering Pines. Every case reminded him of those faces on the wall, those hollow-eyed children sitting at that table. But he didn't walk away from helping people entirely. He now volunteers with a nonprofit that trains first responders in trauma-informed approaches to child welfare cases. Special Agent Victoria Lambert transferred to the FBI's training division at Quantico. She develops curriculum teaching new agents how to handle cases involving crimes against children, drawing on her experience with Whispering Pines. If she can't undo the horror she witnessed, at least she can prepare the next generation to handle similar cases with competence and compassion. The legislative changes sparked by the case have been adopted in 17 states beyond Montana. The Whispering Pines Child Safety Act requires residential facilities to maintain real-time digital records of every child in their care, accessible to state inspectors 24/7. Surprise inspections are mandatory quarterly. Any discrepancy in population counts triggers immediate investigation. It's the kind of regulation that shouldn't have been necessary, the kind that only exists because 42 children died while the system failed them. In 2024, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children established the Gallery Memorial Scholarship Fund in honor of the Whispering Pines victims. It provides financial support for survivors of institutional abuse to pursue higher education. All 6 survivors have received funding through the program, as have dozens of other young people who escaped similar horrors. The scholarship isn't named after Eleanor Dresden. It's not named after the facility. It's simply called the Gallery Memorial, a reminder that those 42 children existed, mattered, and deserved better than what they received. Some people have asked why the case is remembered as the Gallery of Innocence, when that was Eleanor's twisted name for her crime. Shouldn't we call it something else? Something that doesn't use her language? The families discussed this extensively. Their answer was thoughtful. They kept the name because it represents a reclamation. Eleanor meant gallery as a display of her power, her control, her twisted art. The families redefined it as a memorial to innocence stolen, to childhoods destroyed, to lives that mattered. They took her word and made it mean something different, something that honors the victims instead of the perpetrator. As for what Eleanor Dresden would have faced legally if she'd lived to stand trial, legal experts have provided detailed analysis. The charges would have been extensive and unprecedented in their scope. 38 counts of first-degree murder, premeditated killing of each child, 38 counts of aggravated abuse of a corpse, the desecration and processing of remains, 6 counts of felony child endangerment. For the surviving children, 6 counts of forced participation in criminal activity. Making children help create death masks and prepare bodies, 6 counts of psychological torture. The systematic conditioning and trauma inflicted on survivors. 38 counts of fraud. For each set of falsified letters sent to parents, federal charges of wire fraud. For using mail and phone systems in the commission of crimes, federal charges under the RICO Act. Eleanor's operation constituted an ongoing criminal enterprise, multiple counts of kidnapping, holding children against their will through fear and control, cannibalism-related charges. While not explicitly defined in Montana law, prosecutors would have pursued novel charges related to the processing and consumption of human remains. The sentencing would have been consecutive, not concurrent. Each murder would have carried a life sentence. Montana has the death penalty for aggravated circumstances, which this case certainly involved. Legal scholars believe Eleanor would have been sentenced to death or received 38 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole. She would have died in prison, one way or another. But she chose to escape that fate through suicide, denying the families their day in court, their chance to confront her, their opportunity to ask why. That's perhaps the cruelest part of her final act. Not just that she avoided earthly justice, but that she left so many questions unanswered. Why did she start killing? What made her believe her twisted philosophy was righteous? Did she ever feel remorse? Did she understand the magnitude of suffering she'd caused? The journals and videos provided some answers, but not enough. Never enough. To Katie, James, and the 36 other children whose names I've changed to protect their families' privacy, you deserved so much better than what happened to you. You deserved adults who protected you instead of preying on you. You deserved inspectors who did their jobs instead of taking bribes. You deserved a system that valued your lives above bureaucratic convenience. The Gallery of Innocence was meant to be your prison, your eternal display case. But you're free now, free from Eleanor's control, free from the fear and hunger and terror. The butterflies fly for you. The garden blooms for you. And the people who loved you will never, ever forget that you were here, that you mattered, that your lives had value beyond the twisted purposes Eleanor Dresden tried to impose on them. May you rest in peace, may the survivors find healing, and may we all learn from this tragedy that protecting children requires more than good intentions. It requires vigilance, accountability, and the courage to ask difficult questions even when it's easier to look away. The Gallery of Innocence is closed forever, but the memory of those 42 children, their hopes, their fears, their dreams cut short, will live on in the hearts of those who loved them, and in the reforms that bear witness to their stolen lives. They were children. They deserved better. We will remember.